Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much. So I am so excited that you've joined me for part 3 of our story tonight. It's fabulous to have you here with me, and it's a very exciting story because we're now in a situation where a woman who used to live in England is now living in America and has had a very bizarre encounter with a Bigfoot on the road, and some missing time went with that encounter, so she's wondering if it actually happened at all, and who can blame her for that? So let's continue with our story, shall we? You fell asleep by the stream. Is that the best you can do? Connor snapped at them. I've never heard anything so ridiculous in all my life. You're sitting by the stream, are you? And then you fall asleep just like that, subsequently failing to come back to the farmhouse in time for lunch. You were away for hours. What on earth is wrong with you boys? I could see that Connor was absolutely furious with the both of them. He wasn't buying into their feeble, seemingly spurious excuses one bit. And the story about them waking up with braids in their hair made him all the more mad. I guess he thought his children were spinning a wild over-the-top yarn, and had probably messed around braiding their own hair, although he didn't stop to actually consider why they would do such an enigmatic thing. Do you know how long Fee here has been slaving away at the stove for you, to make you a decent lunch, and you both never bothered to show up? I raised you boys to be better than that, and to have manners. But what happened to them? I'm sorry, Dad, but we're telling you the truth. We were sitting by the stream. We woke up and there were braids in our hair. We aren't making any of this up. You have to believe us. Please believe us, Dad. I don't need to listen to this. What do you take me for? A complete mug, said Connor. We both know that you braided your own hair, boys. If you're going to lie to me, you're going to have to do a hell of a lot better than your poxy, far-fetched, fanciful stories that carry no weight at all. I can hardly bear to look at the both of you when you spout such nonsense at me. I would have hoped that you would have both had the decency to own up to your rudeness, instead of coming up with these outrageous excuses to explain your atrocious behaviour. Is it so hard to tell us the truth? What is wrong with the both of you? The least you can do is to admit you got carried away with the time. Is that so hard to do? But Dad, you don't understand. We didn't make this up. We did fall asleep by the stream, said Hamish insistently. I noticed that Cameron gave him a sharp nudge with the back of his elbow to shut his brother up. He interjected on behalf of his brother and said, Sorry, Dad. You're absolutely right. Me and Hamish, well, we got carried away with the time. And as for the braiding, we braided our own hair. We made the whole thing up. I guess we felt really bad for letting you down, that's all. Well, that's better, said Connor. Finally you're prepared to own up to your insouciant behaviour. But it's not me I want you to apologise to. It's Fee. You put her out. She was the one that prepared the lunch. So I want you to apologise to her. We're really sorry, Fee. Oh, for goodness sake, don't apologise to me. I wasn't put out in the slightest. It really isn't a problem, I said to the boys. I understand it's the school holidays, and it's so easy for you to get carried away and to lose all track of time. It happens to the best of us. Don't you dare worry. I wasn't slaving away at all. I was just making tortilla wraps for lunch, so it's no biggie that you missed it. You're too nice to the boys. They don't deserve you, Fee, said Connor. It was after dinner that Cameron surreptitiously came up to me. He tapped me on the back, Lucy dear, and you know what he said? He said, Fee, I think that Bigfoot might actually be real. Why do you say that, Cameron? I asked him. This is a turn-up for the books for you. but he suddenly looked as if he thought he'd said far too much, and completely shut down on me, Lucy. I want to tell you, dear, that something happened to Connor's boys in that woodgrove, but they're not talking any more. But I think they had an encounter with a Bigfoot. So my own story that I was beginning to doubt, I unequivocally now believe was real. Of course, I haven't shared any of this with Connor, as he would think it was all completely absurd. But I assure you, none of this is made up. When Paul read my mother's letter, I was completely confounded. Bigfoot, I said. Are those things even real? We never talk about such creatures here in England. Well, said Paul, from your mother's letter it would seem that they are. I mean, she didn't make up what she saw on the road that night. It's quite some story, don't you think, Lucy? Well, it sure is. But you must remember she'd been hypnotised, so her mind could have been all over the place, couldn't it? Not really. It's not the same thing, said Paul. She had hypnotherapy to reduce her desire to take pain meds. She was in her right mind when she had that encounter. But it was so insanely bizarre, Lucy. So she's second-guessing herself, isn't she? Doubting what she saw. But I guess that's what happens. Imagine for a moment, Lucy, you wake up in the middle of the night. You hear a strange noise. You trot over to the window to investigate. And there in your yard you see two green men standing outside a large spacecraft. They tell you they're real. The next minute you know in the blink of an eye that they're gone. Would you doubt what you'd actually seen? Of course I'd doubt it, I admitted. I would think it had to be part of a dream. Why would you think that? Paul challenged me. I guess because it's so outlandishly weird. Because it's the last thing I'm expecting to see in my yard. Exactly right. That's the whole point, said Paul. If you leaned out of the window and you see your cat on the footpath outside, you would know what you were seeing was real. You wouldn't doubt it for a moment. You would accept that your cat was part of your reality. But a spacecraft and two green men are so paradoxical, you're bound to persuade yourself it never happened. You're right, I agreed. That does make perfect sense. Then, of course, your mother noticed the Bigfoot had tiny braids in front of his torso. Remember that? That's a detail you'd never ever see in a dream. So how do you explain that, Lucy? And then both her two stepsons returned to the farmhouse with braids in their hair, like the ones she saw on the Bigfoot in the road. So that's rather bizarre too. She couldn't explain 2 hours of missing time, could she? And in the same breath your stepbrothers cannot explain how they were asleep for so long. You've got to admit it's rather bizarre, and there's definitely a connection here somewhere along the line. It is strange, I agreed. When I left for the airport in the late afternoon, instead of being reluctant to go to America, my mother's incredulous story invited within my spirit an unbridled enthusiasm about the adventure that lay ahead of me, like an unexplored treasure map. I privately wondered if I would encounter a Bigfoot myself, and hoped that I would. Not that I would expect anyone to believe me if I did, but I didn't really care about credibility, as an experience with a Bigfoot would be nice. When Paul read me the letter, I felt a lot better about going to the States. My mind was fleetingly distracted from my hatred towards my mother, which I suppose was a promising start. It had, of course, been incredibly hard to say goodbye to my beloved father and to Paul, my very best friend, who were both at the airport to see me off, and by the sorrowful, lugubrious expressions on their faces, I might as well be going to another universe. You will be good, my father said, with glassy eyes. Don't be so hard on your mother. Remember, she loves you. I resisted a scoff. I hugged my father so hard. I didn't want to let him go. My father was my entire world, and in my eyes he could do absolutely no wrong. Paul gave me a friendly hug and whispered in my ear, You better meet that Bigfoot. I want to know all the details. I want to hear all about it. I grinned at him and gave him a thumbs up. And then with tears spilling down my cheeks, I let them watch me drift away from them, like an autumn leaf being blown away on the pavement. I left them, feeling a lump in my throat and a heaviness in my heart. I'm glad to say the flight to the States was not too uncomfortable. But then again, whenever is a flight comfortable, unless you're fortunate enough to be sitting in first class, which I wasn't. But at least I had a window seat, and was sitting next to a small couple who were constantly getting up to stretch their legs, which meant I didn't have to keep asking them to move, which was a huge relief. It was when we arrived at Atlanta's main airport that I was filled with a nervous trepidation. For a brief moment, I didn't even want to leave the plane. I was filled with an all-consuming dread about being reunited with my mother again, after 4 long years. My chest felt as if it was filled with a colony of butterflies that were all flapping their wings at once. I was told that Connor Dumbarton would be meeting me in the airport arrivals hall, which was a relief. At least it postponed the agony of getting up too close and personal with my mother. I was not sure what Connor looked like, but I spotted him at once, as he towered over and above everyone else in arrivals, and he was holding up a sign that was hard to miss. He was an attractive-looking man for a man of his years, and when he saw me his face broke out into a huge friendly grin. I was determined not to be overly friendly towards him, but he didn't appear to be at all put off by my aloofness. "It's good to see you, Lucy," he said, giving me a big friendly hug. "Welcome to America. It's your first time here, is it not?" I nodded. "How was your flight?" he asked me. "I hope it wasn't too uncomfortable for you. It can be very claustrophobic in those aeroplanes." "It was all right," I said, not wishing to expand too much in conversation with this man. Before long, I was sitting comfortably on the passenger side seat in his large SUV, as Connor drove me to the family farmhouse, which seemed like quite a long way away in the countryside. "I thought it was best, Lucy, that I picked you up in person. I know you've been very angry with your mother for a very long time, and I understand how you feel. But I want to promise you this. She never willfully intended to hurt you." I could feel the bile rising up in the back of my throat. "My mother was a married woman. You had an affair with her, and then you took her away from us back to America with you. How do you think that feels?" I said indignantly. "I cannot imagine what it feels like, Lucy. It must have been brutal for you, and of course for your father. I wish me and your mother had done things differently, but there was no way that we were going to avoid the inevitable hurt that we would ultimately cause. Your mother wasn't happy in her marriage with your father, and I'm sure she's told you that. But she still loves him very much. But they just didn't have much in common." "So you thought you'd steal her away from my dad, did you? That's so rich." "It wasn't like that, Lucy. Me and your mother started off as friends, but we had so much in common. One thing led to another, and we fell in love. We could not imagine our lives apart from each other." "Stop making excuses! I hate it when adults make excuses like you're doing." "I'm not making excuses, Lucy," said Connor gingerly. His hands were on the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were exposing their white bones. "Lucy, I do not know what to say to you, or how to make anything right again. But I do know this. Your mother loves you very much, and she is hoping that this trip will help you resolve your differences with her. Please be kind to her, Lucy. She never meant to hurt you." "I think we can agree to disagree on that. My mother did intend to hurt me, and I can't be persuaded otherwise. I wish I didn't come to America. I didn't want to come here, but my dad made me feel I had to come." "I hope you're going to enjoy yourself with us, Lucy. I really do, because you are so welcome here. And I know for a fact that my sons are looking forward to meeting you." I'm not sure what else Connor was spitting out at me. I realized he was trying to soften me up before I actually saw my mother again. But I had no intention of being warm towards her. I hated her with a burning passion. I needed her to know how much she had hurt me. When I arrived at the red-bricked farmhouse, my mother ran out of the house with 2 boys running after her. The 3 of them had bright, excited smiles on their faces, as if seeing me was the most wonderful thing in the world. It was hard not to cry to receive such a warm welcome. It was emotionally so moving and made me feel so incredibly loved. My mother, without reservation or doubt, threw her arms tenderly around me and just cried. In that moment, my hatred and bitterness towards her dissipated. I wanted to hate her for what she'd done to me, but I couldn't any more, because once I was in her arms, my heart melted, and all I felt towards her was love. And that was when I realized I needed to let it all go, to let the hate go that I'd been harvesting over the years towards my mother, because it was not serving me. "Oh, Lucy, dear! Oh, I can't believe it's you! I've missed you so much! You have no idea! I can't believe this is happening, and that you're actually here with us now! It is so wonderful to see you, my love," she told me through glistening tears. "And all I can say, my darling, for all the dreadful hurt I've caused you, I'm so, so sorry." I do remember we sobbed and sobbed in each other's arms, and it felt as if the heaviness between us had finally lifted, as if the huge iceberg that the Titanic had faced on that grueling, inauspicious day had finally been shifted. "These are your two step-brothers," my mother said to me proudly. "This is Cameron," she said, pointing to the taller of the two boys, who was smiling at me warmly. "This is Hamish." Both the boys were rather shy and bashful, but shook my hand politely and said, "Hello, Lucy. It's good to meet you. We've heard a lot about you. Welcome to America." Within days I'd settled into the farmhouse and was made to feel so incredibly welcome by the whole Dumbarton family. I'm glad to say my mother took me to one side after I had rested a while from the flight. We had a long talk together, where she explained to me why she'd left my father. It was not easy to listen to what she had to say, but I knew I needed to hear her out and to try to see things from her perspective, which was incredibly hard. "I'm afraid, Lucy, dear," she had said to me, "I was so young when I met your father all those years ago. He was quite the charmer back in his day, you know. I fell for him hard. We were both besotted by each other, but at the same time we were very young and callow, you know. Within 5 months of dating, your father had proposed to me, and I didn't hesitate for a moment to say yes. My parents weren't remotely happy with my getting married so quickly. They both felt that me and your father should get to know each other a lot better before we made such a decision. My own father took me to one side and said, 'Vi, you've always been very impulsive, but as your father, it would be remiss of me not to warn you that sometimes when we do things in haste, we repent at leisure. You barely know this young man of yours. Why don't you date him for a while? And then, if you want to get married another year down the line or so, all well and good, you will have my blessing.' I didn't listen to my father's judicious advice, because I thought I knew better. I was naive, extremely willful, very, very stubborn. I believed I wanted to be with your father forever. I was so in love with him. He was a good-looking boy, and I thought he was all that. Let's just say after I married him, the cracks began to show in our relationship. When I realized that me and your father did not exactly have very much in common. And believe it or not, Lucy, that is a big deal. I told my father about my feelings concerning my marriage to your father, that I believed I'd made a catastrophic mistake in marrying him, and he suggested that I got divorced. I told your father I thought we should call it quits on our marriage at the time, and he even admitted that we were probably not right for each other. But then, lo and behold, I suddenly discovered I was pregnant with you. And that was when I realized that I needed to make the relationship with your father work. We had a child on the way, which changed everything. Believe me, we both tried to make the marriage work. I wasn't at all happy. And when I met Connor Dumbarton at the riding stables, we became remarkably good friends. Connor was coming to the stables to ride one of the horses there,
after working hours in the city, and that was how we met. We had so much in common, and that was when I realized I wanted to be with him. I kept putting off telling your father what was going on between Connor and myself, until I could put it off no longer. And yes, I regret so many of the choices I made, but I have no regrets moving to America and marrying Connor. It was the right decision to make, but I always regretted the hurt I ultimately caused the both of you. I want you to know, Lucy, I never regretted having you, nor did I blame you for wishing to stay with your father. I respected your decision to stay with him, because I still love him, you know. I always will. You cannot stop loving someone when you've been married to them for so long. Your dad is a very good person, Lucy, and he will always have an incredibly special place in my heart. And he feels exactly the same way about me. We will always remain the very best of friends, you know. It was after my conversation with my mother that I decided to let my hatred towards her go, as the only person that I was hurting was myself. It was like I was carrying a coal in my hand that was burning only me, and the only way I would stop burning myself is letting go of the coal. I began to fully appreciate why my mother made the choices she did, and I could see why she was so much more suited to Connor Dumbarton than she'd ever been to my father. I knew she was right. People make mistakes in their lives, don't they? Sometimes the mistakes we make along the way and the poor choices can hurt the people we love the most, but without mistakes, we would be unlikely to learn very much. I began to realize that I was beginning to enjoy my stay in America, and before long both Cameron and Hamish had taken me all over Georgia to show me all the sights, and I was having a wonderful time. The Dumbarton family had an enviable lifestyle. That was true. There was no doubt in my mind that my mother had been right in her letter to me, that America was indeed an incredibly large country. The wide open spaces really threw me. When I asked my mother about her Bigfoot encounter that she had written about in her letter to me, that Paul had read to me, she confirmed to me that I was the only one who knew her secret, which made me feel rather special. It's not that I don't want to share my Bigfoot encounter with Connor, but he is a very sceptical man, and I don't know whether he'd actually buy my story. But some things can be difficult to share, even with those we love, Lucy, because they're profoundly personal. Do you understand that? I think I do, I said. Do you think that Cameron and Hamish had a Bigfoot encounter of their own? I asked her. I mean, they came back from the Woodgrove one day, late in the afternoon, having missed lunch. They both had braided hair. In your letter you mentioned the tiny braids that you'd seen on the Bigfoot's torso, the one that you met on the sequestered country road in the middle of the night, after you'd been driving for a while, after having enjoyed dinner with the hypnotherapist's family. Do you think the Bigfoot you saw might have braided Connor and Hamish's hair as well, without them even knowing about it? Because they claimed to have fallen fast asleep, which was why they never turned up for lunch, if you remember. I think something did happen, my mother admitted to me, but I'm afraid my stepsons have not been very forthcoming about anything. But I do know that Cameron said to me that he believed that Bigfoot was real, and then he shut down after that. But for him to say that was incredibly revelatory as far as I'm concerned. Do you think I might see a Bigfoot while I'm here? I asked my mother, already knowing what she was likely to tell me. Ostensibly, I couldn't help myself. Since I'd arrived in America and had learnt about my mother's story, I was so inquisitive about the subject of Bigfoot. I never imagined I'd be so piqued in such a subject, because I'd believed that Bigfoot was a legendary creature before. But now I knew differently. I had done a ton of research at night on the subject, while sitting up in bed in my bedroom in the Dumbarton household, and I discovered that people had all manner of encounters with Bigfoot-like creatures, from fleeting sightings to moving experiences to downright terrifying encounters. And I discerned that, like human beings, Bigfoots are as individualistic as we are, but the likelihood of my meeting one was very remote, but I could still live in hope, couldn't I? I hate to blow your bubble, Lucy, dear, my mother had said, but it's incredibly unlikely you will encounter a Bigfoot while you're here. I'm not saying it's impossible, of course. Stranger things have happened. But I would say don't get your hopes up, my dear. In my experience, when you're looking for something, you never find it. And it's when you're carrying on with your life, nonchalantly as you do, when surprises invariably happen. I assure you, Lucy, when I was travelling down that country road, the last thing I expected to see was a Bigfoot. It was so profoundly bizarre that it's taken me a long time to actually accept that I saw it. Sometimes I still struggle with that, but I know it was real. I knew my mother was right. In my own life, when something of mine went missing, I'd search for it everywhere, sometimes never finding it. Lo and behold, it would usually only turn up when I was no longer looking for it anymore, and probably no longer needed it. I'd also found waiting for things always took so long, like a parcel in the post that took forever to arrive. In truth, that was the story of my life. I was resolutely determined that in one way or another I was going to get Cameron and Hamish to talk to me about what had transpired to them on that day that they arrived back at the farmhouse with braided hair, after having unexplainably fallen fast asleep by a stream of water in the woodgrove, and were seemingly indisposed for about 3 hours. Their hair had been mysteriously braided during that time. I knew even if they wouldn't talk to my mother, and to their father, I was quite sure that I could persuade them to talk to me. I was going to get Cameron and Hamish to dish up the dirt about what had obviously transpired on that day, when they arrived back at the farmhouse incredibly late, with no explanation for why this was the case. They claimed to have fallen asleep by a stream of water in the grove, and were indisposed for a significant length of time, and in that time they had had their hair mysteriously braided. I knew even if they wouldn't talk to my mother or their own father about the incident, I could easily persuade them to talk to me. We were getting on famously well together, given we were of similar ages, especially when my 2 step-brothers were beginning to call me Sis. That was the best thing they could have ever done for me, as I really wanted to have siblings of my own, and now I had 2 brothers that had adopted me as their sister. To all intents and purposes, Cameron and Hamish were very much alike, like 2 peas in a pod, you could say, with curly blonde locks that cheekily frolicked around their cute heart-shaped faces. They had beautiful greenish eyes, and were both reasonably tall and rather lanky like their father. I found that Cameron was much more outgoing and extrovert than his younger brother Hamish, who was more reserved, but he was a deeply thoughtful boy. I do remember when both my stepbrothers shared their incredulous story with me. Never did I expect in a million months of Sundays to be quite so blown away, but believe me, I was. I had known all along I would manage to prize it out of them somehow, with a little artful persuasion on my part. It was a scorchingly hot summer's afternoon, when Atlanta had been hit with an unforgiving, formidable heat wave, which had barreled across the globe unabashedly, and countries like England and France were also victim to its unfortunate ferocity of searing temperatures that left people dreaming of colder climates, where people were enjoying significantly cooler weather. There were accounts of people dying all around the world, where the temperatures were so fierce and relentlessly unforgiving. I do remember on this particular day, it was ferociously hot out of doors, that the idea of going outside was possibly as attractive as putting your head in an oven. The horses were suffering in the meadows with a thriving fly population buzzing obtrusively around their eyes. So my mother had covered their heads with netting designed purposely for horses to keep the flies at bay, and had successfully installed fly traps all over the place to catch the nasty little buggers. If you looked out of the kitchen window, the searing sunlight was so bright, and the once green grass had become significantly drier, almost as if it had been bleached and scorched by the sun from a cold winter, but this was from an insufferable blistering heat. It really was that bad. Everything was looking tired and strained. If you wanted to be out of doors, The only way to gain light relief was to walk among the grove of trees, in order to receive the pleasure of their glorious all-encompassing shade.
Me and my two stepbrothers were eager to embrace the great outdoors. We naturally gravitated towards the shaded areas on the property as you do, almost as if the tall, lofty trees that welcomed us had now become our new best friends. In a trice the day moved steadily forwards, as we merrily rode on the back of our ATVs, down the undulating paths of the woodgrove, sprinkled with leaves and fallen twigs. We laughed happily among ourselves, glad to leave the blaring light of a very unpleasantly hot day behind us, to welcome the idyllic, lush, subterranean oasis that was now dappled in an ethereal light. I think all three of us felt rejuvenated and recharged among the congregation of stately trees, with their proud, lofty deportments and large outstretched boughs adorned with a plethora of leaves, which were like huge umbrellas above our heads that wilfully blocked out the obnoxious, blaring hot glare of the sun. In truth, it was such a pleasure being in this tranquil space that invited you to meditate on your thoughts and to absorb everything around you, so that we barely even spoke among ourselves. We parked our SUVs and walked over to the stream, with its fast-moving water that galloped over the rocks at a speedy pace. We all threw off our shoes and rolled up our pants and began eagerly paddling in the refreshingly cool water, which was so clear we could see the stones beneath our feet and tiny fish charging past us. After a while we sat on the slight hilly embankment, overlooking the stream, still shaded by congregations of weeping willows. We threw stones into the water, skimming them very graciously. Every time my stone hit the water, it was with the grace of an overweight dog, which both my stepbrothers appeared to find hilariously funny. "Don't laugh at me," I chastised them. "You're my teachers, for goodness sake, and by all accounts you're pretty useless. Otherwise I'd be skimming my stones across the water rather proficiently." Cameron laughed. "What do they say? A bad workman blames his tools." I ignored his snub and quickly changed the subject. "Thank God it's cool in here. I can't believe how hot it is out there today." "Yeah, the weather's pretty brutal at the moment," admitted Hamish. "I find hot weather makes me pretty sleepy. That's why my mother says they have siestas in Italy during the late afternoon, to re-energize themselves, so that they wake up later to enjoy the cooler part of the afternoon," I told my brothers. "I didn't know that," Hamish admitted, "but it makes sense to me. What I did know is that in Japan they don't mind if you fall asleep behind your desk at your workplace. Even if you're the top CEO of a company, you're allowed to do it. It means you've worked hard. It's a good sign. If you did that here in America, you'd probably be fired on the spot." "So tell me then, what happened when you fell asleep by the stream?" I asked. "When your hair was mysteriously braided, and you turned up for lunch 3 to 4 hours late." "How do you know about that?" asked Hamish incredulously, his face going so white it looked like it had been drained of all its blood. "My mother mentioned it in one of her letters to me. That's how I know. There's more to the story than meets the eye. I knew that at once in my gut, you could say. Call it an instinct if you like." I could see Hamish and Cameron exchanging secret guarded looks together that suggested they were not likely to let me in on their story. So I pounced on them in a way they never expected, like a cougar on a deer. "It was a Bigfoot, wasn't it, that braided your hair? Come on, out with it." "I know it was." Both Hamish and Cameron's faces now went as white as a blank piece of paper. "How can you possibly know about that, Lucy? You're from England, aren't you? You're less likely to believe in Bigfoot than people living out here are. But how could you even know this? Are you psychic or something?" I chuckled. "Give me a break. Of course I'm not psychic, but I can read between the lines. So are you going to tell me your story or aren't you? I'm your stepsister, am I not? Don't I deserve to be in on the secret?" "Yeah, you may be our stepsister, but you're not a sister by blood, are you?" said Hamish coyly. I pulled a face. "I'm sorry, but that doesn't count. I'm still your sister. Please," I begged. "Please tell me." Finally Hamish, who had a heart like butter, melted at my earnest pleading. He held his brother's gaze beseechingly,
And finally Cameron shrugged his shoulders and nodded his head somewhat stiffly. All right, we'll tell you, Lucy. But if you dare tell anyone else about it, we'll tell people you made the whole thing up. Do you understand? We'll deny it. We're not going to own our story. Get it? I nodded. But of course, who would I tell anyway? I hardly want to be ridiculed myself. So there we are. That's the end of part 3 of our story. Part 4 is tomorrow night. I'm looking forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.